How's it going, internet? I haven't been online for a while, but I just felt like it was necessary to lay down some thoughts that I have had on my mind for a while, um, particularly in regards to nationalism. This is not necessarily a Marxist critique for how we understand nationalism. This is not necessarily a too far left of an approach for why nationalism doesn't work. This is mainly an impromptu speech. I haven't really prepared any sort of notes for this kind of conversation, but I just really wanted to talk to you as the viewer, whoever you may be. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. There are some fascinating things that we have seen develop since 2016 throughout the Western world when we talk about the nature of a country, the nature of a nation, and what we actually come to regard as national identity. So, seemingly since Brexit, the entire Western world has been completely shaken in regards to how we actually understand the purpose of a country in relation to other countries, the purpose of the cosmopolitan agenda in today's world, and how we actually will eventually come to understand uh, political divergences. So why the reason why nationalism was obviously successful, according to not only a lot of historians but also a lot of political theorists, is because of how we actually have come to um, understand this collective rallying around the flag, around a banner, for the purposes of maintaining a conflict, for the purposes of the self and other dichotomy, for the purpose of alienating and demonizing an otherness that has been trampling over our agenda, that is more progressive, that is better for the world, that is better for us, and so forth. Right? We've seen that in the First World War, we've seen that in the Second World War, and we've seen that in the Cold War also, and in the rather small scale conflicts, comparatively speaking, small scale conflicts that the United States has been engaging in, as well as Russia when they've gone to Afghanistan, and then back then USSR, as well as the United States, and so on. So we see that we notice this pattern of nationalism being successful, at least in the West, hence on the West, emphasis on the West, because of this ability to rally the public around a specific sort of mind, a specific sort of ability to interact with the political platform, with the resources that that particular country has, be it military or communicative or politically rhetoric oriented resources, and somehow manage to convince people that it is in their greater good to sort of unite for whatever reason. And this is in no way supposed to be a similar interpretation for how rather Asian countries have gained their independence, either from the Soviet Union or from their former colonizers. I'm thinking of India, and Pakistan, Bangladesh, and to some extent perhaps small states like Taiwan and Hong Kong, Macau, and how they've kind of been interacting with this problem of a geopolitical hegemon, in that case being China, and kind of their effect over this this sort of dynamic. So the reason why this is particularly interesting in the West is because nationalism, I would argue, is an inherently Western thought. It is an inherently Western conception, and when it got transferred over, when it crossed the boundaries of the Uralic Mountains, it has lost some of that inherent necessity, that modal necessity of grappling the collective, and rather uh, being able to kind of show it more as a power dynamic against an oppressor. And surely this kind of logic is applicable to how the United States was kind of using as propaganda towards the USSR in the Cold War, and vice versa of the USSR by the United States. However, we cannot apply the same kind of all the kind of implications of this modal analysis to how states such as India and Pakistan and Bangladesh and so forth have gained their ability to interact with the greater cosmopolitan platform, with the greater question of what does it mean to have a national identity. And strictly speaking, the Western kind of cases, it seems that this kind of narrative doesn't work anymore, right? It seems that there's this these very apparent divergent factors between how, say, Republicans would interpret the question of nationalism, and how even the Democratic platform would interpret nationalism. And arguably, there are nationalistic tendencies in the DNC as well. And no, I'm not just talking about the revivalism of people like Joe Biden or something. I'm specifically thinking of say these kind of mentalities of the U.S. coming back to the Paris Agreement, of the U.S. sort of, kind of finding its own way with questions of healthcare, with questions of reparations, with, rather under discussed topics of how the native folks should be able to have sovereignty over their land, and kind of the XL pipelines and so forth, which in my opinion are quite under discussed in the American platform. Surely, to some even looser extent, I can argue, or perhaps we can agree, that this idea of college debt, right? This idea that there's these many $1 billion out there that are being owed to the reserve, or to be it private banks, by formerly enrolled students in American colleges, be it at the undergrad or the graduate level, and how these sort of have a nationalistic flavor to it. Say, for example, that we as Americans should prioritize education, and the reason why this is a rally, it's not necessarily an us versus them, but it's rather an us, the Americans, that care about what it means to be educated, versus them, the people that neglect the system of education in the United States, and so forth. And I think this is an interesting dynamic, and I believe it does have nationalistic implications, not necessarily for us overall as a nation, but what does it mean to have a national identity as an educated American, and the importance to be educated as an American. And these are going to rather not be discussed either in further DNC debates, or in any sort of kind of nationalistic fashion, though, as I previously mentioned, I definitely believe that there are nationalistic implications for these sort of dynamics. And it would be interesting for someone on the farther left of the spectrum, say Elizabeth Warren or Bernie, to be able to actually point out these problems and emphasize that there are aspects of gathering together. If we kind of, dissect what nationalism means, if we dissect these kind of meanings and how they've kind of influenced the history of the United States or the history of Western countries, that there are positive things that can come out of nationalism if the conflict is correctly being described as a conflict that is really a problem, that is pressing, and it should be able to, in some way, shape, or form, interact with the main dimensions of the fiscal policies of either the federal government or the state governments, or in this case, a kind of interaction between the public sphere and the private sphere, and so on. And in terms of, say, the English case, I think that's a rather interesting one, right? We've seen two PMs that are decently qualified, one better than the other. That is David Cameron being more qualified than Theresa May. That this kind of problem of tackling Brexit has come to a point where no one can actually understand how to fix it. And I think it's really interesting, especially for a political scientist or someone that is at least interested in politics, to kind of observe this phenomenon and kind of try to understand not only the root causes to it, but also kind of the broader implications for this EU supranational, the supranationalism of the EU, and how it's kind of trying to bind different national identities under this broader umbrella that we're all European citizens, and how this project has been failing. We've seen France being able to somewhat maintain the agenda. We've noticed, during the French elections also, 2016 and 2017, kind of the parliamentary works, that there are some hopeful pro-EU people, or at least moderate left EU people, that would try to maintain the salience of the European Union overall. So we kind of see all of these divergent kind of opinions of why the concept of a nation state doesn't work. And this is where I'm really trying to go with this monologue, really. Or in this case, if it is interactive to some extent, to this dialogue, that what is really nationalism today? Because nationalism, as we have come to know it, as it has come to develop, as it has generated the idea of constitutional democracy, as it has generated sort of the problems that we're interacting with in terms of what it means for supranational institutions such as the UN or WTO or the IMF to sort of have a jurisdiction over the power of sovereign governments, and kind of see this great hesitation of states to give in to this broader framework of a kind of institution that would have authority um, over the very constitution of a sovereign state that is rather slow, if not almost impossible, and kind of the ramifications of that. But that is perhaps for another video. What I'm really trying to get at here is that nationalism as we know it is pointless. Nationalism as it has come to be known through the lens of the late 19th and 20th century, political decisions hasn't really been helpful for our understanding of what does it mean today to be an actively civically participant citizen. And the reason why this is important is because we see how it affects the internal domestic discourses of some of the most formerly powerful states, and even to today they have a great influence. England still nonetheless is a highly salient player in the international sphere, but nonetheless we kind of observe these dimensions of how some of the most fundamental ideas, some of the most fundamental concepts that have given rise to what we know today as a national identity, be it the American identity or the English identity, or to some extent European identity, are being under pressure. And sure, there are other very salient reasons, such as migration, that kind of lead to this discussion. But what I'm really trying to focus on with this video is the problem of the internal, with the problem of the domestic kind of view on why nationalism fails. Because nationalism works if people are able to gather around, if people are able to actually give in or be persuaded by this collective consciousness agenda, by a mind that is sort of, uniting. Say you give in the inner individual freedom for a greater collective. Obviously, nationalism itself will never actually explicitly say that, but nonetheless, nationalism in practice does do that. It is a sort of extensive social contract under which the collective kind of bargain of society kind of has a power over an individual's capacity to express themselves either as a citizen within their own country or of the same citizen abroad in another country, or overall citizens of different countries interacting with each other, and kind of the things that is permissible for them to say about their own place and so on. And I'm not necessarily, in any way a soft moderate. I would still consider myself quite to the far left. But nonetheless, it is important for us to be able to discuss these things without appealing always to heavy Marxist readings, because it's not the way to have a conversation. Throughout my experience, perhaps limited, but throughout my experience of actually interacting with people on the right, we will never be truly able to discuss some of the core problems that we have, be it core problems as a country, or be it core problems that should transcend politics, but they don't, because politics is always going to interfere with every process of decision making. But say, in the same way that, as stupid as this may seem to other leftist friends, as stupid as it may seem to explain to a Republican in the United States that it is completely redundant to feed into a capitalistic system that will always benefit the wealthy, that is only going to prioritize the people that are at the top, that is always going to prioritize, say, bailing Wall Street over, using even a small fraction of those funds for bailing out the student debt, or reducing even perhaps by 1% the defense budget of the U.S., and somehow being able to channel that money into loan forgiveness. This is something that is not going to happen, right? And I am actually quite fascinated that no one in the DNC has actually proposed anything in regards to the federal defense. I'm kind of perplexed as to why no one actually has a coherent, intelligible foreign policy. I mean, I guess to some extent you can say that Tulsi has been trying her best to kind of express the problems that a good president requires, a good management of both foreign and domestic policy. However, America seems so divided now that it is unable for your average hearer to kind of understand the importance uh, of what it means to have a coherent foreign policy. And surely everybody would agree, regardless of whether they're on the left, and even some moderate Republicans perhaps would agree. Here I'm thinking of the Republicans that voted for Trump and then regretted it, that uh, America's job after Trump is going to have to be to reestablish the international rhetoric that Obama was able to kind of manage. And I'm not saying in any way that Obama was some sort of uh, foreign policy genius in any way, but he was doing the cleanup job, right? Everyone in the DNC should agree that what Obama was doing for 8 years was basically to clean 8 years of Bush 2. And in the same way, whoever is going to have to follow Trump is going to have to do the cleanup job that Trump did. So, but that is not enough. That is a very insufficient kind of idea to go off of, especially when we're discussing such a sensitive and important topic like international relations. It is definitely under discussed, and it is quite fascinating to me, at least, that no DNC candidate has been able to put out an intelligent foreign policy prospectus. But then again, let's go back to the divergences, because this is what I'm really trying to emphasize in this conversation. It's that the divergences that we have in the U.S. kind of lead to a political system where nationalism is impossible. And I'm sure that to a great extent, a lot of Republicans would not want nationalism as we used to know nationalism during, 40s, 50s, perhaps 80s. Surely there are terrible, racist, extreme cases that would prefer that, and that's wrong and that's messed up. But that's not the people that I'm trying to target with this conversation. The people that I'm trying to discuss here are basically the folks that are sufficiently considerate to other people's problems, to problems of people that were not born in the United States, that are trying to make a good effort to come here, that are making a good effort to kind of understand, the economic situation of the United States and kind of fit in and so on. To those kind of, to that kind of group of people that even a reasonable Republican would kind of, sympathize with. Those are the kind of people that the DNC should really focus on, kind of, being able to explain to them why their view of the nation, the way as they picture the United States to be, it's not going to be something that the United States is actually going to turn out to be. And yeah, all these divergences again that we see in the DNC and the RNC really lead to this dynamic where I think that nationalism, at least as we used to know it in the West, is kind of going to go away. There's no kind of fundamental idea, there's no like thread that would be able to connect Americans, regardless of where they stand on the political spectrum, and be able to sort of bring them together. And I think the same can be said about the UK. I think the same can be said about a lot of other problems that are going on in Europe. And yes, this is it for now. I'm looking forward to any sort of discussions.